This is a continuation of the first segment we were looking at, and the question is Anglican Protestant? And many people assume that Henry VIII started Anglicanism in the 16th century, and hence it is one form of Protestantism that emerged at that time, along with the Lutheran tradition, the Calvinist tradition, the Anabaptist tradition, Quakers, Baptists. But this is to misunderstand Anglicanism. I can use an analogy. If a garden has weeds in it, a person can do one or two things. They can destroy the garden and thereby getting rid of the weeds, or they can weed the garden and allow the flowers that are in the garden to continue. Now, what the Anglican tradition did in the 16th century is part of one of many reformations, in fact, in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Whether it was Latimer, Ridley, Cranmer, Jewell, Hooker, their argument was there was much good in the Catholic heritage, in the creeds, in the councils, in the liturgy, in episcopacy, in many of these things. And they argued, yes, there were aberrations in the Catholic Church, but the best way to reform the Church is to weed the garden, not to destroy the garden itself. And so the Anglican tradition remained deeply Catholic, but not Roman, and thoroughly reformed because it listened to the concerns of what was going on the continent, and Luther, Calvin, aspects of the Anabaptist tradition, but it was not schismatic in that sense. And so this is the via media of what we would call the Anglican way. Look back to the wisdom of the past, to the great theologians, to the liturgy, to the sacramental tradition, to the mothers and fathers of the patristic era, and so it wanted to keep all the sort of intellectual flowers, the garden that had been well cultivated over 1,500 years, recognizing there were weeds in the Roman Catholic tradition, but wanted to keep the best of the Catholic heritage. The English tradition in the 16th century, as I mentioned, also turned to the continent and saw the valid critiques at a theological level, at a liturgical level, at an ecclesial level, a public level, an economic level, of what was going on in Europe in terms of the work of Luther and Calvin and those who followed in the Lutheran tradition, and within the Reformed tradition. Many of the great reformers, like the Marian exile, Jewell, and then who was really the mentor to Richard Hooker, they argued that the reformers on the continent were on to something very important in terms of weeding the garden, but they erred in splitting up and fragmenting the church. And so the English tradition took the position that we must keep the best of the flowers of the Catholic tradition, weed the aberrations in this particular heritage, draw from the noblest elements of the Reformation going on in the continent, but critique their schismatic and fragmentary ways. The English were being Catholic, and of course at the heart of Catholicism is only in a secondary sense their great liturgical tradition. At the heart of the liturgical tradition is the unity of the Church. And the English traditional way, particularly its Catholic component, insisted and argued very clearly and plainly that one cannot be claiming to reform the church while splitting up and fragmenting the church. And it became very clear to many of the great theological reformers of the 16th century in England that the path the Protestant reformers were taking, in fact, was beginning the process of modernity, beginning the process of fragmenting and splitting up the church. And so they were very concerned with this tendency in the continental Reformation, as they watched the Reformed tradition of Calvin split off from the Lutheran tradition, the Anabaptists split off from the Calvinist Reformed tradition and the Lutherans. And this was, they saw this as a violation of both the Bible's biblical tradition and the creedal tradition of one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And so is Anglicanism Protestant? One would say yes and no. It protests against the aberrations and distortions of the Church, but it remains deeply Catholic and thoroughly Reformed, and it lives with these great tensions. And this is the via media and the genius of Anglicanism.